Thank you for that, Sarah. All right, I'm going to get right into introducing our panel. We're short on time. We want to respect your time and that of our panelists. So I'll start by introducing each of them, and then we'll proceed to our conversation. Farina King, all the way at the end, to your right, is Bilangana Dine, a citizen of the Navajo Nation, an assistant professor of history and affiliate of the Cherokee and Indigenous Studies at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. She is the author of The Earth Memory Compass, Dine Landscapes and Education in the 20th Century, published by the University Press of Kansas in 2018. She has been working on a book with an autoethnographic approach about Navajo experiences in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints during the 20th century as her current and upcoming project. Michael Lynn Steele, who is sitting in the middle, thank you, is a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians in New York. She graduated from Georgetown University Law Center in 2001 and joined the faculty of BYU Law School as an associate professor in 2014. She has taught federal Indian law, evidence, and civil rights. After beginning her legal career with Sonosky, Chambers, Sashke, Anderson, and Perry, a highly regarded DC law firm, specializing in the representation of Indian tribes, Professor Steele worked for 6 years as a trial attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Beginning in late 2009, Professor Steele worked for several years as a counselor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Larry Echohawk, at the U.S. Department of Interior. Professor Steele holds a bachelor's in arts and a master's of arts in the humanities from BYU, with an emphasis in English, literature, and Native American studies. Ronnie Joe Draper, all the way to our left, is an enrolled Yurok tribal member. She began her schooling, like many Native children, in the Head Start program and has essentially been in school ever since, as a student and a teacher educator. Her scholarship has focused on the ways in which teachers can create opportunities for all students to learn and thrive, and how teacher educators can prepare teachers to do so. In addition to her scholarship, Ronnie Jo engages in social justice activities outside of academia. She currently serves on the board of the American Civil Liberties Union of Utah, where she serves as the president-elect, and is also on the national board of the ACLU. James Singer is Dine and is a diversity fellow in sociology and ethics studies at Salt Lake Community College. He is currently finishing his PhD in sociology with a concentration in labor markets and social policy. His research is concerned with the social mobility and the American dream. In 2018, he was the Democratic nominee for the U.S. House of Representatives for Utah's 3rd Congressional District. James has served on several boards of directors, including the Rape Recovery Center and the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance. He currently resides in West Valley City with his family and has held various callings within the church. I'll just start with the first question from here, and then I'll move over to the table. But we wanted to begin by giving each of our panelists an opportunity to describe when, and if you want to describe when and how did your family or yourself individually come into the church, and what was that experience like? To get started, we'll just start with Ronnie and Joe and work our way down the table and then go from there. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for being here. I joined the church when I was 19 in a pretty boring way. Missionaries knocked on my door, and I chatted with them. And so I'm the only member, an LDS member in my family. My father is Yurok American Indian. My mom was white, and so, but we had no religious affiliation, and then I joined the church.
So on my dad's side, my dad is white, and they are pioneer people. And I'm sorry, I can't tell the story of their joining of the church. I'm sure it was in Europe somewhere. And on my mother's side, where we're Seneca, in the 1940s, missionaries went to the reservation in western New York, the Cattaraugus Reservation, and 2 of the people who accepted their message were my great-grandmothers, Florence Parker and Nina Tallchief, and that they became sort of the heart of a congregation there.
I just want to also recognize that we're on the homelands of the Ute people, and that's something to remember as we're here today. My dad was a convert to the church. He said he liked the Mormons the most because they didn't scare him as much as the other ministers. The other ones were always touching him and trying to take out the demons, and he said that the Mormons were the only nice ones to him. So I guess it pays to be nice sometimes, right? And my mother, she's white people from Cleveland, Ohio, and she also met some missionaries. And the 2 of them had the grossest story. They met on Temple Square. My dad, he still works for the church. He works on Temple Square as a security officer. And my mom was a hostess before they had sister missionaries doing that job. And they ended up liking each other. And they got married at 9 months, and 2 days later, I was born.
Jape, it is an honor to be here in the ancestral homelands of the Ute and Shoshone peoples, Goshute and Paiute peoples who have also dwelled and converged in these spaces since time immemorial. But I'm coming... I also have a mixed heritage. In Dene, we introduce ourselves by our clans. She'e Bilagana Nishle do Kia Ani Bashishchin, Bilagana Dashache do Sinijani Dashanale Akot Egot Sa Nishle, Dene do Gamali Nishle. So those who speak Dene know will recognize each other as Sheke, kin, and that not only when we evoke that clan, we evoke the obligations and the accountability that we hold to each other. And we are a matrilineal people, so I do honor my mother, and that she is from Michigan. She's from primarily British American, Irish American descent, and so I have descent from white settler ancestry through my mother, and I am born for my father's people of the Navajo Nation, the Towering House Clan and Black Streaked Woods people. And I am Dene Navajo, and Gamali is what Navajos call Mormons or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because I am a BYU baby. Maybe some of you are as well. Your parents met at BYU, and my parents did. My dad decided to go to BYU after working for an Idahoan family. And they told him about the Book of Mormon, and he said, go read Custer Died for Your Sins. But he did decide to come to BYU. And at the time when BYU claimed to have more Native students than any other university in the country. There were over 600 Native American students that came on this campus, and they were leaders in Indian education for higher education in the 70s when my father was here. And so my dad was set up on a blind date with my mom, who also was a convert to the church. My father eventually decided to join the church after taking a Book of Mormon class for non-members. And they raised me and my siblings in the church, but between the Navajo Nation in Denebikeya and the East Coast in the DC area, since my father worked for Indian Health Services and was kind of like we're IHS brats, like military brats moving around wherever the government sends us. So that's my background of I grew up not with the Cougar song, but actually Go My Son, for some of you who have these connections to those those 70s of BYU Native students and their presence here on campus. That's my background.
Thank you for those introductions, and also for honoring the indigenous land that we are blessed to be able to gather on. Next, I would like to ask the question of sort of that relates to the title of this panel, and I'll frame it this way. When did you become aware of the tendency of church officials and its membership to embrace Columbus within the Restoration narrative, right? Or it is the story of how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints comes about. Ronnie, Joe, I don't want to keep picking on you, but he recently had a wonderful article in the Daily Universe, which if you didn't see it, I encourage you all to look up. And would you mind starting us off on?
Sure. I was introduced to Columbus and the Restoration narrative while I was investigating the church, and as I was, looking into whether or not this is where I wanted to exercise my faith and exercise my religion. The two young men who were the missionaries who were teaching me were white, and when they would tell me that story and then tell me even about the Book of Mormon and how the Book of Mormon was a book about my people, I just looked at them and thought, no, that's not how that works. And I tried to explain to them that my people didn't come to the Americas via the Middle East, and that the origin of my people is, the story begins with them on a river in the mountains, and that's the beginning of my people, and that what they were telling me didn't match that, but I think that they just felt sorry for me, that they didn't, we didn't really kind of go to battle on that, because I just thought, well, they're not going to get it, and they just think that I'm ignorant and that I'm an idiot. So I let that go. And obviously I found a lot of things that resonated with me in terms of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that I could overlook their misunderstanding of how Indigenous people came to be and who we are. So, so that's what, that's how that went down. But at that time, the introduction to the Book of Mormon suggested that they were right and I was wrong. And I had to just ignore that as well. But then more recently, and I'm not remembering the date that the introduction to the Book of Mormon changed, and I've lost contact with those missionaries, but the introduction of the Book of Mormon has changed to suggest that I'm probably right. And and I haven't been in contact with those missionaries to say, good try, boys. But there are other possibilities as to the origin of my people, and even to the restoration narrative. Like I can believe that Indigenous people prepared this land. I can, given the Indigenous people I know, that seems very likely. According to the Book of Mormon, Christ brought Christianity to the Americas, and so Columbus was late on that move as well. So I'm not a fan of Columbus, but I wasn't taught for him to be a fan in my home. That wasn't the grand narrative around our table, and I feel fortunate for that.
Thank you. Michaelin?
Yeah, so I grew up in Western New York and went to elementary school, and I heard all the stories of manifest destiny and how everything that happened was for the good, and the heroic tale of the founding of America. And I don't remember being taught that about Columbus specifically. I know Columbus had a heroic role in the tale of manifest destiny and the mythology around manifest destiny. I remember thinking that perhaps that scripture in the Book of Mormon that talks about a man among the Gentiles might refer to Columbus, but I don't remember being specifically taught that. I do remember being an undergraduate at BYU in 1992, which was the quincentenary of 1492, in the landing of Columbus. And there was a lot of veneration and celebration of that anniversary. But there was also, here at BYU, counter-programming, I guess, counter-narrative that was more nuanced and looking at some of the truths behind the heroic story that had been built up. But I do remember being at a sacrament meeting where all of the speakers were assigned to talk about Columbus and how great Columbus was. I think it's the only sacrament meeting I've ever walked out of. So, because really to me, sacrament meeting is about the Savior, and I thought that was an unusual choice. And maybe had I stayed, I would have learned something. But I wasn't interested in the intertwining of what I know to be gospel truths with sort of historic mythology, myth-making. And so that's my experience with that.
Thank you, James.
I think I beat you on that one. They asked me to speak on Pioneer Day. No, it's like, but I think that's kind of part of that larger narrative of, I think when we are brought up, like specifically in the church, we are socialized to think certain ways and have certain narratives that make sense to us. And so from a very early part of my upbringing showed that, yes, this part of the narrative was essential for the gospel to be restored, right? Which, you know, as a young person, it's like, okay, that makes sense. Good. I guess there's a reason for why genocide occurred. All right, interesting. But as time went on and starting to understand how race operates in the United States, and how it's been a part of our history and continues to be part of our history, and the making sense of hierarchy, it got me to think about that passage in the Book of Mormon about how it was Columbus who was, touched by the Spirit and brought here. And there's no denying that he definitely felt some closeness to divinity, inspiration, right? But by their fruits he shall know them. And he raped and killed and murdered and enslaved and didn't even think he was in the Americas. Until the day he died. He did not think this was a new place. So he discovered nothing. And he knew he discovered nothing. So it got me to think about this a little bit more critically. Not critical of the church, but critical of how we use narratives and how those things have shifted over time. One thing that I point to is our deep doctrinal ideas of race when it came to blacks in the church, and how this was held, but it was a form of white supremacy that exists within the church. And I have to have faith that at some point this idea, the veneration of Christopher Columbus, will also fall by the wayside and bring equality among the children of God, us as brothers and sisters and others, that we can all glory in that and not look at this as a thing that had to happen. And just the last comment here is about that, is that there have been proposed ways, and actually at church a couple weeks ago, I told someone I was teaching, Intro to Native Studies, and how we were coming up across Columbus and how this was a difficult time. And the brother looked at me and he just said, well, the genocide may be hard, but it was prophesied that it had to happen. And that's what I wanted to say. But I just kept that and pondered that for a second, and I thought, here's how this works. Because agency is a part, an essential part of who we are as children of our Heavenly Father, and part of the gospel plan, is that things may have happened, but it doesn't mean that it had to have happened that way. There are always different ways in which truths can be brought about, in which events can take place. Just look at the Book of Lehi and then the other plates that were involved there. There were options that were available. And so it does not give anyone the excuse of looking at something and saying, well, this terrible thing happened, but look at all the good that came from it. Yes, that's true, but you are also ignoring the great amount of bad and evil that also came from it too. You have to balance both of those. And I think it does us a disservice as a religion, as adherents of the church, to hold on to this backwards and damaging narrative.
Thank you. Farina?
I, in a similar way, was blessed to be raised in a home where there wasn't this, veneration of Columbus, but my early awareness of these narratives that were around us is that I remember getting my first Book of Mormon and going to get the little stickers that you can put to mark special scriptures, and they have little designs on them or images that are kind of see-through. And I got one for 1 Nephi chapter 12, verse 13, and it had Columbus, his face on it, the image off of the artists and different depictions of him. And that went over the scripture of the individual seen prophesied by Nephi as the man among the Gentiles who'd crossed the seas. And so in this way, we're all complicit in that there's so much omission, and just whether we're conscious of it or not, we're just sailing along and passing by. And I didn't think it was a big deal. I didn't really think much about it. And I was fed, like many of us are, through K through 12, celebrate 1492, discovery, these terms, this language of we celebrate Columbus because he discovered America. And it wasn't until actually I came to BYU and I had some amazing history professors here, Jenny Pulsifer, one of them, who's here now. And I was in her class on American Indians in colonial America, and she brought up the debate about Columbus and how with 1992, the controversy of Columbus finally being the exposure of him and the histories that were always there that James and others are referring to, even in his own writing that we studied in the class. We read about how he processes and sees Indigenous people as potential slaves, dehumanizing them, depriving them of their liberties, and starts the slave trade trying to enslave Native Americans, even if on the other side he thought of himself as bearing Christ and seeking to Christianize the savages, right? And so in these courses and discussions that we started to have in college, it wasn't until college that I'm starting to unpack what it means when we just don't say anything and we go along with celebrating Columbus. And why are we celebrating him, or why do we feel defensive about Columbus, especially as Latter-day Saints, and how we interpret this scripture is it reveals the entanglements that we have with the doctrine of discovery, the idea that as soon as Columbus had his voyages, there was a papal bull that declared justified the European conquest and control of parts of the Western Hemisphere, basically all the Western Hemisphere. And that went into, as Michael and Steele mentioned, manifest destiny and even our own legal systems and structures. Why this matters to me on a very personal level, where I had my awakening, is I realized how much truth was missing, how I could not understand the truth, even about my own family, our own stories, that I didn't understand the trials of my own people, Dene, who my grandparents died by the time I was young because of cancer and different exposure that I learned about in my family to uranium mining and different struggles that deal with environmental racism, different dynamics that have connections to the legacies of settler colonialism and doctrine of discovery itself, that peoples feel justified to come in and dispossess others of their land, and then they villainize Native Americans in these narratives, whether it's Dene, Haudenosaunee, Yurok, or Ute here, right? Or they invisibilize them, they erase them as well. They're either the villain or they're not even here on campus. And that hit me too, even reflecting on my time at BYU, is, as I showed in the images before, you see only a statue of Massasoit, and that's seen as a kosher native because he was the friend to the pilgrims. But we didn't learn until I was in Pulsifer's class about the Wampanoag and the wars and the struggles, and that even Massasoit's grandchildren would eventually be enslaved and sent off, and his son beheaded. And we don't continue those important parts of history and understanding what happened in our past and how it still continues to affect us today. This is why public memory, memorialization, it matters. And it also matters with healing and really reconciling and seeking to be one, truly children, all of God. And that's why I'm up here and felt like we need to have these conversations, because people aren't even aware of how propagating Columbus and how they seek to argue, well, it had to happen, right? Those kind of language. They don't understand how entangled, inseparable that is from these various dynamics and ongoing violence that happens.
Thank you. Thank you for those responses. In sake of time, I'm going to switch and kind of what I want to emphasize, I think what we all want to emphasize, right, is that this is not about Columbus entirely, right? I think as we said over lunch, right, Columbus has had his time, right? So we're going to move on. We wanted to address this, right? So not to say that it's not important, but I think, right, a more important question would be, right, we've been talking about notions of, right, Columbus in his narrative is part of the narrative whiteness, or more honestly, right, white supremacy that embeds the history of the country, that embeds the history of every institution that has come from it. Religious, educational, universities are part of it as well. But what I want to ask and get your responses to is, how have Native American indigenous communities challenged these notions, challenged assimilation, challenged notions and narratives of white supremacy, of practices and policies that have sought to erase their culture, their history, and contributions, right? Because we have a panel here of 4 Native scholars, indigenous scholars. So indigenous folk didn't go anywhere, right? They're still here, and you've been fighting and struggling against this and thriving. So would you mind speaking to that and to relieve some pressure off you right now? let me start. Michael, can I start with you?
Thank you. First of all, also, thank you for being here. This is great to see an overflow crowd that is interested in hearing and centering Indigenous voices. Is really, we're honored by your presence as well. So I often tell this story about a little girl from Western New York who was doing whatever grade it is that they study the Indians of their state. She was doing a report. Her dad asked, could she call me and interview me about her, for her report. And so, cute as could be, she called and she said, when you were a Seneca Indian, what was that like? What did you eat, and what did you wear, right? And so it crystallized for me. I repeat that story often because it crystallized for me that in school she was being taught that natives were a thing of the past. And that has been the policy and goal of the United States almost from the beginning. I often say, too, that with the iPhone, the thing that might surprise the founders more than anything else is that there are still natives. There are still indigenous peoples. There are still such a thing as tribes. I think the expectation, and it wasn't just implicit, they explicitly hoped and planned that sort of the forced assimilation of the tribes would be successful, that there wouldn't be such a thing as the tribes. And yet the tribes survived, many of them, most of them. I don't know if I can say most of them, but great many. And certainly there is such a thing as a Native American in the 21st century. And how did that come to be? And despite the pressures of sort of being counter to the heroic narrative that I was talking about earlier, the march of progress and the advancement of civilization that sort of required that we trample and stamp out what was primitive, and that was the tribes, right? And I often say, and I can say this in an LDS congregation of like this, a gathering like this, that the tribes were preserved by the hand of the Lord. And why was it that the policies and programs of the United States to eliminate tribalism and eliminate tribal identity, that was the specific goal. The idea of the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and then an education program that said, kill the Indian to save the man, right? That's not that long ago. My grandma was in boarding school, right? And so how did the tribes overcome the concerted military, political, fiscal pressures, cultural pressures to eliminate tribalism? How did they survive, and why? I say that, the tribes knew how to care for themselves in this land for a long time. And so there was something of innate resilience that has enabled that endurance. I think blessed by the hand of God, and I also think it is part of the prophecy. If we understand some of the Book of Mormon's theology, or just the story of Joseph being sold by his brothers into slavery, and then becoming the means by which the house of Israel was rescued during the famine. And then we sometimes see echoes of that story in the Book of Mormon, that the stick of Joseph was preserved, that in a time of spiritual famine to come forth. I think there's a third echo in there, and that is the preservation of the native peoples. And I've recently been working on a paper that deals with the idea of resilience theory, what makes things endure, and what could we learn by studying the survival of the tribes. How could that inform our understanding of why things bounce back, why things endure? How could it inform resilience theory? Legal resilience, to survive as legal entities, to survive as cultural entities, as peoples, as distinct. And so I think there's much to be gained from the study and from listening to tribal voices. What has been preserved? I'll even say by the hand of the Lord. What type of a famine? Cultural famine, spiritual famine, and sort of the environmental change, all those kinds of things, where we might, as a people, need to turn to the Indigenous people to learn about survival and need to accept the gifts that they're willing to offer.
Thank you for that. James, you have to add?
Yeah, I'll add something to that. I think that these are, the question was how have, but how, I think a better phrased question is how do Native American and Indigenous communities continue to challenge assimilation and other narratives and practices? I think from my own personal experience from last year, talking about the importance of our public lands and going to San Juan County and seeing the debate that is very present there, wherein in our Western ways of thinking, land is property and land has to be productive because it has to contribute to this larger capitalist project, which means that all things must be commodified in some way. Now, there have been all sorts of wonderful things that have come about because of this, right? We have roads and streets and clothes and cell phones and everything, right? All of our products that we consume. But it is really short-sighted, really short-sighted. It is a way of thinking and being that says, if I don't see it, then therefore it does not exist, which is weird. If I don't acknowledge racism and the centrality of whiteness, therefore it does not exist. If I don't see carbon dioxide, then it doesn't exist. And so what is the challenge to that? It says that there is indigenous knowledge that says things that maybe we have forgotten, but yet we still hold as part of who we are as members of the church. Is it the centrality of family or kinship? And this is integral to Indigenous identity and life. When Farina was talking about the importance of that, and she mentioned her clans, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, she's my sister. She's my clan sister, which means we have obligations to each other. But it means that we see the earth as it says in our own doctrine, that it is our mother. It has a soul. It's a living, breathing thing. And the other creations were also related to that. But our current society alienates us from that. It pushes us away. We become de-individuated. We become part of cogs in a giant machine. And the Indigenous way of doing that is saying, no, stop this. We are all related here. And what we're doing to our planet will bring about the demise of everyone. We have the knowledge. We can solve this problem. But there's this pride that exists that says, we cannot listen to you. You do not have the knowledge that we do. You don't have the degrees. You don't know how to be good managers. And so the bureaucratic process of all this, although there's a great knowledge that exists among Indigenous peoples, is constantly running up against systemic barriers that keep all of us from experiencing joy in this life. And so I think that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to at least bring this to the attention of people in Utah's 3rd Congressional District, to say there are other ways, and these are ways that we all agree on, but we have to critically think about, are we giving in to a plan that separates us from each other and from God and from his creations? Are we going to continue to give into that? And I think the Indigenous way is showing that there's an alternative, vital way of thinking and being that can help to save all of us.
Thank you for that response. I just wanted to also thank you, James, for correcting my question, which, no, but I think it's an important teaching moment. It shows how colonialism, this is what we mean when we say you need to decolonize our minds. It's embedded with how we ask questions, right? That question was framed in the past tense, not the present tense, implicitly implying, right, Indigenous people in the past. So I sincerely thank you for that. Farina?
Also, again, unpacking these kind of questions is folks have a lot of different connotations associated with activism or resistance. It evokes a lot of thoughts and memories with that. But even just to identify as Native American, or more specifically Dene, or a specific people, to identify with a specific people, in this context and history, that is taking a stand. And it also brings to mind that for people, it's not activism, it's living. That even your own life and to breathe, as was mentioned with the history here, Native and Indigenous peoples throughout this country were targeted to be wiped out or changed. They couldn't be themselves. They couldn't have those ties to the land. There were different tact and strategies to target them and to eradicate that. So to be able to just say, I'm Dene, that is taking a stand. And it is just trying to live. It's not always this idea of, oh, you're being an activist, that's a terrible thing, why are you shaking things up, why are you doing this? No, I'm just trying to live and recognize my ancestors and remain tied to them and connected to them is what I'm trying to do. Something that also hit me with this question was that idea of strategies, what people just do by living. Maybe strategy is the word, I don't know. It might not be the best word. But for instance, I've been fortunate to meet many different peoples. And when we say Indigenous and Native, that's also homogenizing. It's also hard to delve into these intricacies and complexities of different peoples. And so I am so happy that I have been in Oklahoma, I've been in Vermont, or these different regions, and learned about stories of how certain peoples, like in Vermont, that Abenaki, they had to just pass on a song at times because their own women were targeted for sterilization to stop reproducing. Children tied to that heritage. And so being able to mask their identity was a strategy at times, or just passing on a song to their children. And I think about even with my own family, there is strategizing how to be in safe zones of being Indian or being Dene, that we seek safe zones because of this onslaught of eradication, of seeking to target and wipe out this peoplehood and these ties to lands as a key part of that indigeneity as well, right? And what it means. And even with my own father, what I found is maybe he was filtering himself, and the way that he was relating with us is we heard him singing traditional Navajo songs at Boy Scout, Eagle Scout ceremonies. And because, it was no longer okay to go to ceremonies, right? But he was able to sing some songs at the Boy Scout events, which is got its own issues. We can talk about that another time. But that meant a lot to me because it sparked my curiosity of what is he singing in Dene Bazad? What is he saying? What is this song? And what does it mean? And then that sparked my curiosity. And in a way, that was an embodied way of passing on and living, being Dene, and something that he learned that song from my Nali, my grandfather. And he was passing it on, but just in this different, trying to maneuver and navigate these new situations and efforts. And I was able to learn more about what that song means and how it emphasizes a central idea of Dene, from Dene, of Hajo, and teachings that we have of harmony. You can't really translate these teachings. They just are embedded in that language, right? A lot of you are great at languages here at BYU. So it's like a whole different mindset and idea, even in the language. And language was targeted. My father went to boarding school, dropped off when he was 5 years old without warning. And his parents, they loved him. But they felt like that was the only choice they had to see him grow and be successful. And it was beaten in him that Dene language is useless, that it's no good. But embedded in it is such rich, intricate ways of knowledge and seeing the world that I'm being blown by, but just starting to learn it again, trying to reconnect with it. So it's also this effort of reconnecting, revitalization, but then the vitalization as well of how do we have this survivance and continual presence and being, right?
I just want to say that, my challenge of my indigeneity happens in white spaces because that's where I'm not seen as an Indigenous person. It's easy for white people to identify me as a white person and to speak to me as a white person and to relate to me as a white person. I don't view myself as a white person, and so that feels very frustrating to me. When I try to sort of introduce the fact that I am a Yurok woman, then I'm met with a lot of interrogation by white people who I don't know if perhaps they think they have like a checklist in their hip pocket that they can use to determine my Yurokness. But they ask me a whole slew of questions challenging my indigeneity. And increasingly, I'm refusing to answer those questions because I understand that how dehumanizing and how I don't want to participate in that activity as a legitimate activity that individuals can do to another person. I also, when I think about myself, I don't think of myself as having Indigenous heritage. I don't like that term. I am a tribal member. I am a voting member of a sovereign nation. I'm a citizen of a sovereign nation. That feels very different than having heritage. Through my mom, I have Norwegian heritage, but that's very different than being a citizen of Norway. And so I feel like I'm constantly in white spaces having to educate or either be quiet and have people assume I don't exist. What I do really appreciate is that I do have spaces in Indigenous spaces where I can fully be myself and express myself and without people questioning me or interrogating me. And that, I don't know, like my idea of a really beautiful, peaceful world would be a world without that interrogation that I only get from white people. I don't get that from other people of color, and even for folks who aren't Indigenous. So that, for the white folks in here, you can do better. And so start today by not asking questions about people's blood or where, if they're raised on a reservation, or what their Indian name is, or if they dwell in teepees, or all of those questions I've heard within the last month. So these aren't olden-timey questions. These are the questions that we face on a regular basis that really do a lot of damage. And we could be talking about a lot of beautiful things without and not talking about that. Sorry, I'm going to get mad now, so I'm going to turn this mic off.
Thank you. Well, we are, I believe we're just out of time, 50, right? Is that what we're scheduled up to? So this one, and I know that other people that some of you have class, and we have to respect the time. Some of our panelists have to run as well. So we'll stop at least this part of the discussion here, but I'll invite, as we close, if you have questions, a few of our panelists may be able to stay after, and you can come up and ask them questions in that way, and you can interact with them from that point, so if you don't mind. But if you'll join with me, please, in thanking our panelists for taking time, for being here, for sharing with us.